The Honourable the Chief Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to move the motion standing in my name, which reads as follows. This House condemns the Leader of the Opposition for attempting to mislead the readers of the Gibraltar Federation of Small Businesses' excellent magazine, In Touch, by the use of the following statements and arguments which are entirely false, namely, that the Chief Minister compared Spain to North Korea at the United Nations, that the Chief Minister associated himself with the comments of Dennis Matthews at the United Nations that Spain was a terrorist state, that the opposition had created a reef which the Leader of the Opposition, in common with Spanish Partido Popular politicians, describes as having laid concrete blocks on environmental grounds when barely a few meters on it now plans a land reclamation next to the airport, and that the government is misleading the public on both public finances and the strength of the economy, and notes that the Leader of the Opposition is clearly prepared to ignore information provided to him in this House or pervert it in order to serve his own agenda and ambition, whether or not that misuse of information is damaging to the public interests of Gibraltar. Well, Mr. Speaker, honourable members have dealt with our previous motion suggesting that we are filibustering to avoid the debate of the next motion. Let them support us in not having to do so in this case, and let us have a prompt debate dealing with this matter. Mr. Speaker, the Gibraltar Federation of Small Business has a magazine. It interviews local political personalities and business personalities, and this month, or this season, because it is published by season, was the opportunity of the honourable gentleman to have his say to members. Mr. Speaker, this is a magazine that goes to members of an important business organisation, and therefore it is important that the information that we provide to those business men and women is correct information, and it should be corrected if it is not correct, Mr. Speaker. And there are two statements in the interview the honourable gentleman gave which are clearly misleading, Mr. Speaker. In fact, they are absolutely wrong. The first, Mr. Speaker, is the first of the comments referred to in my motion. He says, when dealing with me and frontier restrictions and whether or not I might have been involved in the matter, the following. Was it necessary to compare Spain to North Korea at the United Nations, or associate yourself with the comments of Matthews that Spain was a terrorist state? Mr. Speaker, it doesn't seem to me that there is much room for doubt as to what it is that sentence says. Have I ever compared Spain, or indeed Mr. Madrigallo, etc., Spain, the government of Spain, to North Korea? I have, Mr. Speaker. I did so in an interview during the course of August 2013. Was that the right thing to do? Well, Mr. Speaker, clearly the honourable gentleman doesn't think so, but I must tell him that if he was stopped by one lady down Main Street telling him that she was going to listen in, and I hope she is, because it's important that Parliament be seen by as many in our community as possible, to tell her how much she appeared to sympathise with him on the subject of the motions, then I must have been stopped by thousands in August 2013 who told me that I was absolutely right to make that comparison. Was it at the United Nations, Mr. Speaker? No, it was not. Mr. Speaker, did I associate myself with the comments of Matthews, by whom I interpreted that the honourable gentleman meant Dennis Matthews, that Spain was a terrorist state? Those comments were made at the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, I did not associate myself with those comments. The honourable gentleman asked me in this House whether I knew he was going to make those comments, and I said I did not. I have not said anything in any interview which might remotely be suggested to support that I in any way am prepared to associate myself with a statement that Spain was a terrorist state. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, those very damaging allegations are entirely deprecated. I do not accept that I said those, and therefore certainly not the North Korean issue at the United Nations, or associate myself with Dennis Matthews' comments that Spain was a terrorist state. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman in the same answer goes on to say asked himself this question: was it necessary for the government to lay concrete blocks? Mr. Speaker, we call it a reef on this side of the House, and for us it's a bit like Falklands and Malvinas. We don't think we've laid concrete blocks, we think we've created a reef. But in common with every Spanish politician that refers to the reef, the honourable gentleman chooses to call these concrete blocks. I mean, at least he doesn't say it with spikes, although they have spikes, but that's what a reef is about. Anyway, he says, was it necessary for the government to lay concrete blocks on environmental grounds when barely a few meters on, it now plans a land reclamation next to the airport? Well, Mr. Speaker, which reclamation is that? The reclamation planned next to the airport is not something that we now plan. The reclamation next to the airport is a plan that we inherited from honourable members when they were in government. A complex plan, Mr. Speaker, that requires a lot, as the honourable gentleman will know, of logistics to be in the right place, and a rubble mountain, and a lot of truck movements, and aeronautical studies, and ensuring that things are done absolutely properly so that they do not have transboundary effect. And a project, Mr. Speaker, that when asked by honourable members opposite, I believe specifically in respect of this project, or reclamation generally, but I believe specifically about this project, I said we still believed was in the socio-economic interest of Gibraltar to ensure we were able to deliver when it might be logistically possible. Well, Mr. Speaker, then it is not something that we are planning now. In other words, it is something that they were planning, which we still plan to do. But we did not create a reef in an area which we are trying to protect environmentally to now create a reclamation. Not that, Mr. Speaker, environmental protection and the creation of a reef and reclamations are things which cannot live side by side. In fact, reclamations can sometimes create more marine life than they spoil, because the revetments are actually one of the things that create marine life. In fact, Mr. Speaker, honourable members might recall that recently we had to move a number of what most of us would call limpets, but have a detailed scientific name in Latin, which the Honourable Minister for the Environment is not here to remind me of, in an area which is now considered to be of huge environmental importance, but which is actually a revetment to a reclamation created in the times of the GSLP. So he shouldn't give readers the impression, Mr. Speaker, that reclamations and environmental protection are things which are mutually exclusive. But in any event, that is not something that we now plan. And Mr. Speaker, when he goes on to what is his question 7, 8, and 9, he suggests, Mr. Speaker, that, of course, everything we're saying in relation to the economy is just not credible, is untrue, is not to be believed. Well, Mr. Speaker, I actually don't think he does Gibraltar anything other than a disservice when he does that. But, Mr. Speaker, that is a matter entirely for him. But our view on this side of the House is that what he said there, for all the reasons that have been ventilated on a number of occasions in relation to the debate, not least a few moments ago in the debate on whether he misled the House by failing to accept that he did not know that Hassans were instructed by the Sunborn. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is our position in relation to matters which relate to public finance and the economy. And, Mr. Speaker, we do not believe that it is in the public interest of Gibraltar that the Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition, who holds an important post in Gibraltar, but not a constitutional office, but an important post in Gibraltar, should be making statements which are misleading for the reasons I have set out. Speaker, I don't believe I've spoken for more than 10 minutes, and therefore I trust that those who might wish to accuse me of filibustering will speak for less.
I now propose a question in the terms of the motion moved by the Chief Minister. Does any honourable member wish to reply?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Yes. Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to take considerably more than 10 minutes. I think that it's an important motion that the honourable gentleman brings, and dealing with important issues. Mr. Speaker, it must be the first time, Mr. Speaker, in the political history of this place that a member of this House, let alone a government, brings a motion that someone, a member of the House, is misleading the public because of something that that person said in a magazine interview. And Mr. Speaker, it wasn't even my best, I have to say. It wasn't even my best interview. I admit that. Mr. Speaker, my chairman, Mr. Hammond, said to me when he read it, "Shame we hadn't finished," and I'm quoting, "shame we hadn't finished developing our small business policies at the time." Because this interview, Mr. Speaker, was given in November of last year. Indeed, you can actually see the poppy in my lapel. Can I have the magazine? You can actually see the poppy in my lapel. It was a magazine it was an interview that was done in November of last year and only published several weeks ago. And he said that, it reads like one of the chief minister's interviews. Nice photo, nice words, but rather scant on detail. That's what my chairman told me. And I said, Mr. Speaker, no, look, I'm being as open and transparent as possible with this House, Mr. Speaker. And I said, I know. I don't like waffle or flim-flam as much as Fabian does. That's what I said to him. But the last three answers in that interview on his handling of our relations with Spain and on his handling of the public finances of this community were absolutely excellent, and I hope that people read those answers. That was what I said to him. And well, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable gentleman for giving me the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, of drawing the attention of the entire community to those three answers that I gave in the In Touch magazine. No flim-flam, no waffle in those answers, Mr. Speaker. And the problem with the honourable gentleman in his handling of our affairs with Spain is that he has, and I'm sorry to say, Mr. Speaker, the propensity of engaging his mouth before he engages his brain. That's really the problem at the heart, the core problem that the honourable gentleman has. And of saying one thing and then doing another, and of being all things to all men. One day, Mr. Speaker, he wants to be a worthy successor of the father of the house, Mr. Bossano, and be more hawkish than the largest eagle soaring the GSLP skies, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, trying very hard to soar in particular higher than the honourable father of the house. And the next, he's the champion of dialogue, wanting to airbrush away everything that he has said. One day, he is comparing Spain to North Korea, and the next, he is sending a missive to the former King of Spain, congratulating him for his wonderful career just before or just after he abdicated the crown of Spain. Speaker, I don't know, Mr. Speaker, whether that is symptomatic of the ideological tensions in his own government that have been most evident in his handling of the fishing crisis, or that is a matter of personal chemistry. I have to say that to the honourable gentleman. He just cannot help trying to be all things to all men. But he cannot expect to be all things to all men and not expect somebody not to pick up on it. Well, and he certainly, whilst I am his political opponent and I am on this side of the House as leader of the opposition, he can't expect me not to pick up on it. Every time, Mr. Speaker, this is the reality, and this is again at the heart of my criticism of the honourable gentleman's handling of our affairs with Spain, every single time he opens his mouth on these issues, I sense a collective holding of breath by the community. Because people understand that the best way is always the calm, measured, intelligent way. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman really is right. He didn't say at the United Nations that, he didn't compare at the United Nations Spain to North Korea. But Mr. Speaker, he compared Spain to North Korea in a BBC programme on UK national TV and also on Sky News, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, there was more coverage.
Channel 4, Mr. Speaker.
And BBC, Mr. Speaker, I have I've gone back and done my research because he's right. He didn't say it in the United Nations. And I'm mistaken. But he said it in the BBC breakfast radio. It wasn't Channel 4. It was a BBC Radio 4 Today programme. That's the channel in which he made his comments. And he said it in an interview with Sky News, absolutely. His comments, Mr. Speaker, were probably more widely reported because he made them on Sky News and the BBC than if he had made them in the United Nations. That's the reality. And I made a mistake, and I accept that I made a mistake in saying that he made them at the United Nations. The problem, Mr. Speaker, with the comment that he has defended in this House is not offending Margallo or the rest of his far-right brigade, Mr. Speaker. The problem, as I have told him on many occasions, is alienating all those Spaniards who do not agree with Mr. Margallo, his policy of punishment towards Gibraltar, or the campaign of slander against this community, including the PSOE, but who both he and I, whoever is chief minister after the next election, hope to persuade to sit down with us in the trilateral talks across a table, Mr. Speaker, because it was the PSOE too that came out roundly condemning the comment comparing Spain to North Korea. And he cannot hope, Mr. Speaker, to champion the cause of dialogue for which one needs to be a valid interlocutor in the sense that people will want to sit down with him if he insults an entire nation, Mr. Speaker, because that's what we're talking about, instead of rounding on the man or his party, a nation. I have absolutely, Mr. Speaker, no hesitation in standing here today and saying that Mr. Margallo has behaved towards Gibraltar like the worst kind of dictator. But I will not compare Spain as a nation to North Korea, nor will I tarnish everyone in Spain with the same brush. I will not do it. And Mr. Speaker, I did go back and I listened to his United Nations speech. And let me give you an example, let me give him an example of what I mean. He may not have said compared Spain to North Korea in the United Nations, but this is what he said, quote, "The face of Spain that we see now is not very different than when the notorious General Franco was in power. Not the face of the Pepe government." I'd agree with him. That's the face of the Pepe government. Not the face of Margallo, the face of Spain, Mr. Speaker. And that is the division between the honourable gentleman and this side of the House. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that the honourable gentleman should have the courage to stand up and defend his own words, as Mr. Lozano has always had, in fairness to him, the courage to defend his words when he utters them, Mr. Speaker. He would not have stood here after comparing Spain to North Korea and want to draw the distinction between Spain and Margallo on the one hand and the PP. He has never drawn that distinction. It's a distinction that I draw now, and anticipating the point that I am about to make, that he has sought to draw during the course of his own speech. Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman says that he did not associate himself with the sentiments expressed by Mr. Matthews in his own speech at the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, if a chief minister of Gibraltar travels to the United Nations with the self-determination group as part of one Gibraltar delegation, he cannot then be heard to utter the words, "It wasn't me," Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. Mr. Speaker, this is the problem with the honourable gentleman being all things to all men. And it is the most feeble of excuses to say that he had not seen, as he told me in this House a number of months ago, that he had not seen the speech beforehand. If he goes to an international forum representing Gibraltar, he is responsible for what is said in the name of Gibraltar from one of the members of a Gibraltar delegation, whether he likes it or not, Mr. Speaker. That's the reality. Mr. Speaker, as to the blocks, he now says, well, the project, the land reclamation project, was a GSD project. Well, Mr. Speaker, he can scrap a GSD project if he wants to. I mean, he's done it before. The reality is that this is now as much his project as it was ours. And the point that I made, rightly made in that interview, Mr. Speaker, was that they've laid blocks on environmental grounds, and then a few meters further down, next to the airport, they're also going ahead with the land reclamation, Mr. Speaker. That is the simple point, and it's also an accurate point. And Mr. Speaker, I'll say this as well in relation to that, that the irony in relation to these blocks, and I'll be saying something about this in a few moments, a bit more about this in a few moments, is that we have a situation where that reef has been laid by the government, or the blocks have been laid by the government, and you have Spanish fishermen coming into British Gibraltar territorial waters, being photographed habitually, Mr. Speaker, fishing in the area or on top of the area of the artificial reef, Mr. Speaker. That is the absurdity of the current situation. But of course, Mr. Speaker, he has opted to keep quiet about that. I mean, one of the parts of the interview which he has completely ignored, Mr. Speaker, is, and I quote something that I said, "What has been achieved by tearing up the 1999 agreement which triggered off the current crisis, when there is more fishing by Spanish fishermen than ever before," end quote. He's chosen to ignore that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, of course he's opted to keep quiet about that. The reality is that for all his championing of the rule of law in British Gibraltar territorial waters, the rule of law no longer applies in British Gibraltar territorial waters since his government took office in December of 2011, Mr. Speaker. And the decision to tear up the 1999 agreement without anything to take its place, Mr. Speaker, amongst the calls from their activists of aquí no se pesca, aquí no se pesca, Mr. Speaker, was probably one of the most monumental errors that any government has ever committed. It's been described, Mr. Speaker, as a rookie error, and I think that that is a quite apposite description. Mr. Speaker, I've told him before, the principal job of a chief minister is to keep the people of Gibraltar safe and secure. That, doing away with the 1999 agreement without having anything in its place, created a huge sense of instability, insecurity, and uncertainty at the very beginning of his tenure as chief minister of this community. For what, Mr. Speaker? For zero gain, as I said in the course of my interview with the In Touch magazine. Mr. Speaker, the reality of the situation is that there is more fishing today than ever before. The reality of the situation is that it was his government, for example, that instructed fishing experts.
Could I ask the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to draw to a close this point about the 1999 agreement, because it is not in any of the paragraphs in the motion.
Mr. Speaker, it may not be...
It is very loosely one can say that it is related to the artificial reef. Very loosely, and to that extent I am allowing the Honourable, and also, of course, it is a matter that he may have raised in the article,
exactly,
which I do not have with me, but the whole of the article is not germane to the motion. Does he get my point? I mean, it's fair enough to make a reference, but he cannot go on and on and on about the 1999 agreement and the mistake which he alleges that the government made. You've made the point, but you cannot labour the point.
Mr. Speaker, I accept the point that the Honourable Mr. Speaker has made, but Mr. Speaker, I think it is germane and it is noteworthy that of all the points that I said in that interview, he chooses to ignore the very point in which his government has come for most criticism, and that is in the handling of the fishing crisis and in the way that they went from no fishing to now more fishing than ever in the space of effectively 3 years. But I will wrap up, Mr. Speaker. I think it was, Mr. Speaker, in my view, it was for zero gain. In my view, Mr. Speaker, there has been a monumental mismanagement by the government of this particular issue, which is symptomatic, Mr. Speaker, of some of the mismanagement that there has been in relation to the wider issue of the handling of our relations with Spain. But turning, Mr. Speaker, to the public finances, because that does form part of the motion very directly by the Chief Minister, Mr. Speaker, what we are seeing is a complete abuse of the democratic process and the laws to ensure that governments do not borrow in a manner that becomes unaffordable for this community, Mr. Speaker. I have already, in the context on the debate about whether I lied or misled this House in relation to the previous motion, very clearly set out the Honourable Gentleman's catalogues of refusals to answer questions and keep half the public debt of this community, some £400 million, behind a veil of secrecy. Of course, the government, Mr. Speaker, is misleading the people of Gibraltar on the public finances, as I said in that article. And that, Mr. Speaker, in my respectful view to this House, is down to him personally, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, the reason why the reasons for the present situation lie, as I have told him before, and I will repeat every single time that I have an opportunity to say so, the big lie at the last election, where he continuously told the people of Gibraltar that the public finances of this community were in a ruinous state, that the GSD was addicted to debt, whilst promising everything to everyone, Mr. Speaker. Because let's not forget that at the root of what we are seeing, in other words, the attempt to have half the public debt of this community behind that veil of secrecy through the use of Credit Finance Company Limited, are the promises that he made at the last election. £750 million in capital projects, Mr. Speaker. The freezing of rents, rates, electricity. The cutting of public debt by half. And the donating of every single last penny of government surpluses to community care, Mr. Speaker. All those promises, Mr. Speaker, and it was not possible to fund all those commitments by conventional means. It simply wasn't. Mr. Speaker, there are limited ways in which a government can fund huge capital projects or recurrent expenditure. It can either borrow, it can either use its reserves, or it can use its surplus income. But if you have a party led by a man, Mr. Speaker, who is telling the nation, our borrowing is too high, ergo, we need to reduce it, our reserves are too low, as indeed he said many, many times in this House and outside it, and I'm going to donate every last single penny of government surplus to community care, well, Mr. Speaker, how on earth was he going to pay for it? Of course. This is the reason why we have a Credit Finance Company Limited. Because the government would not have been able to fund the hundreds of millions of pounds on capital projects it promised and the huge increases in recurrent expenditure at the last election without it, Mr. Speaker. And the implications for the public finances of this community are very serious indeed, because Parliament is unable to scrutinise what is effectively half the public debt of this community. The public debt is nearly 400 million net debt. That's direct government debt. And in addition, what we have is another 400 million of government debt, because the government has to repay that money one day. And it's being used, Mr. Speaker, it's being used, importantly, for government expenditure on government projects. And it's hiding that behind a veil of secrecy. And of course, Mr. Speaker, not only does the government guarantee all the deposits in the Gibraltar Savings Bank, but Mr. Speaker, the Honourable the backbencher himself has admitted, as I said in relation to the other motion, that the Honourable the Father of the House, that £347 million, Mr. Speaker, And that is not a statement of intent that I want him to retire to the backbenchers. I assure him that really I feel safer with the honourable gentleman in the front bench advising the honourable gentleman about the public finances of Gibraltar than I do if he wasn't there. But Mr. Speaker, 347 million by the government, by Minister Vosano's own admission, is being used in order to fund the expenditure requirements, the cash flow requirements of government-owned companies, Mr. Speaker. And the reality is that the government could not have borrowed an extra 400 million directly. It couldn't. Why? Because the net debt is already nearly 400 million. And as we know, on the economy at the size of which it is today, the government would only have been able to spend, out of monies that it has borrowed, another 43 million pounds. It would have been impossible, Mr. Speaker, because there are laws that are in place to prevent governments from borrowing in a manner that becomes unaffordable for this community. And they could only have spent another 43 million pounds, Mr. Speaker. Hence why they have had to effectively transfer 400 million pounds from the Gibraltar Savings Bank into Credit Finance Company Limited, and then used it in order to fund government expenditure and government projects, because part of that money has actually flowed down to GJBS, which is currently engaged in about 200 million pounds worth of government projects, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, the reality, and I would be remiss to the people of Gibraltar if I didn't make the point very clearly, Mr. Speaker, is that the government does not have the money to pay for directly the power station, even on their estimate of the power station, which is 77 million pounds. They just simply don't. That's the reality. Hence why they've needed to create this scheme through Credit Finance Company Limited and transfer 400 million pounds of savers' money. That's the reality, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because the shares of the Slovenian company, Gib Telecom, cost about 30 million pounds, I think it was. I mean, the Honourable, the Father of the House will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's about 37 million euros. The fact that it's not the government that is actually paying for those shares, but the Gibraltar Savings Bank, actually supports the point that I'm making. The government would not have been able, unless it wanted to, really get within 10 million or less from the legal borrowing limits, to have paid for the purchase of those shares directly itself. And this is what we're seeing, Mr. Speaker, and this is unprecedented in the political history of Gibraltar. A government that is willing to ride roughshod, Mr. Speaker, over legal borrowing limits, an architecture which this Parliament has been very carefully introduced, in order to ensure that no government borrows in a manner that becomes unaffordable to this community. And also then, Mr. Speaker, keep it from the scrutiny of this House, by then refusing, as I demonstrated in the other motion, by refusing to answer questions about the Sunborn and about loans provided by the Credit Finance, and about exactly how the money that has been placed in Credit Finance has actually been spent, Mr. Speaker. And for those reasons, I don't resile one word of what I have said, Mr. Speaker, in relation to that part of the interview, in relation to the management of public finances and the economy. Let me say this, just a final point, Mr. Speaker, that it's all very well for the honourable gentleman at budget time to come to this House and say, I have a 70 million surplus. The government has a 70 million surplus. Mr. Speaker, it's complete nonsense. If the government has just used 400 million pounds from Credit Finance in order to pay for expenditure that the government would have of its own pocket have had to pay, of course it's going to have 70 million pounds of government surplus, because it's using the Gibraltar Savings Bank in order to effectively defer expenditure that is properly the government's, Mr. Speaker. Because if the government had spent that 400 million, if the government, for example, had paid 347 million to all those government-owned companies which the Honourable the Father of the House admitted had been paid, if the government had done so directly, it has 347 million pounds less than it has now. So, Mr. Speaker, he cannot crow about a £70 million government surplus, or whatever it's going to be, the surplus, and I have no doubt he's going to produce a substantial surplus at budget time, because the reality is that the government's books, as a consequence of everything that he has done as Chief Minister of Gibraltar, as a consequence of that, it really cannot be trusted, Mr. Speaker. It cannot be trusted as a true reflection of the public finances of this community, and indeed as to the state of the economy.
Does any other honourable member wish to contribute to the motion?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member opposite clearly likes to hear me, because he keeps on saying things that he knows I will not be able to resist. Obviously, the honourable member no longer thinks like he used to think when he was GSLP. So, although I thought he had made a mistake in the move that he made, I am now revising that opinion, because I think he really doesn't belong, and maybe he never did, never belonged with us. Look, if the honourable member is worried about Spain being upset with North Korea comparisons, I don't know, I don't think the GSLP would have been very worried about this. I mean, look, you never know who people like to be compared with or not. I mean, suppose North Korea doesn't like being compared to Spain. I mean, that's a much more dangerous proposition. They're a nuclear power. I've tried to find out what the feeling is like in North Korea, but I haven't had a feedback so far. If there are now Spanish fishermen catching more fish than ever on our reefs, then why are they so upset that we put the reefs there and complain they're catching less? Now, I could understand the level of contradiction and ignorance on fishing and on North Korea, but what I cannot understand is the same level being displayed on things on which he has raised questions before and been given answers before. And I've got a dilemma, Mr. Speaker, when I stand up to follow him, because I say to myself, well, look, I've told him where he's getting his numbers wrong 3 or 4 times. Now, he keeps on getting them wrong. There are 2 possibilities. Either he's so ignorant of the subject matter that he cannot follow the helpful explanations that I give him, or else he doesn't really care about the explanation. He's going to keep on saying the same things, whatever explanations I give him. My dilemma is that if it's a second, it doesn't really matter, because whatever explanation is still going to say the same thing. But if the first, I may be making a mistake in helping him, because eventually he might get his act right, and then it might become more difficult to contradict if he learned to get the sums right. So I can tell him that certainly his comments in this article are not very enlightening. You know, the honourable member says, anyone who knows anything about economics knows that economic growth funded by borrowing is simply deferred taxation. Cameron is going to an election this month, not very far away, no? Precisely on the opposite proposition. The entire global economy is engaged in something called quantitative easing, on the basis that the engine for economic growth is banks printing money, which is effectively government selling debt to central banks. He says everybody that knows anything about economics knows the very opposite. Not true. Nobody that knows anything about economics says such a nonsensical sentence as the one that he wrote in this article. The entire global business community does something which is called gearing, by which they invest more than they have and they make a profit, because the result of borrowing and investing at a margin means that the equity holders get a better return. Without borrowing, we would be living like Neanderthals in Gorham's cave. Does he not know that? It is true that in opposition, the GSLP on occasions criticized the level of debt. Yes, but it is also true that I never did. Because in fact, the learned backbencher would point to that distinction on more than one occasion. And I always said, the important thing is not how much you borrow. The important thing is how you use the money that you borrow. Because if you use the money profitably, then you make money which allows you to service the debt, pay the loan, and have money left for something else. So if you borrow £100 and you waste it, that's bad borrowing. And if you borrow £1,000 and you make a lot of money, that's good borrowing. So the essence of the judgment on borrowing has to be, in my judgment, whether the money is going to result in the creation of growth. And he's saying borrowing is incapable of creating growth. Well, no, that is what borrowing should be for, precisely to create growth. What you don't do is borrow to pay rises, because then you can never escape that debt trap. It is true that there is a ceiling on the debt, but the ceiling on the debt, surely he must know, is a ceiling that was introduced by the previous government, a ceiling which he used to criticize, by the way, because he used to criticize him when it was 100 million. Yes, and he criticized me for not agreeing with him and agreeing with the Honorable Mr. Caruana in the debate of 2003. Yes, I'll give way, of course, I always give way.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable the Father of the House for giving way in relation to this particular point. Now, the point that I made in 2003 was this, that the legal borrowing limit, and this is pre the new constitution, was £100 million. The then government had borrowed over £80 million. In fact, I think the budget was 78 million, but by the time of the general election, it was about 86 million. And the point that I was making there, and indeed is consistent with the point that I've always made on this particular issue, was that the then GSD government had entered into a PFI arrangement in respect of the hospital, which was off balance sheet, and that if you took into account that off balance sheet borrowing, it would take it over the £100 million. Indeed, I think that I was right in relation to that. Not only was the point well made, but also the use of PFI arrangements, which I was critical, and in fact he and the Honourable the backbencher were as one in relation to this particular point. Now it is accepted that PFI arrangements should form part of the public debt. I mean, there's been a report in Parliament in the United Kingdom. So indeed, my criticism of credit finance is exactly the same as I made of the Honourable backbencher at the time. I don't like debt that is off balance sheet, because it doesn't give a true reflection of what is the public debt of the community. That's the point that I wish to make, and thank you for allowing me to make it.
Mr. Speaker, I think my memory of what he said is better than his memory of what he said. But I'll make a point of getting it and sending it to him in writing so that he will see that I am right. I know that he has criticized the PFIs, I know that. But on that debate on the radio, he was not criticizing the PFI. On that debate of the radio, he was criticizing the 100 million, which he said was due to mature and would have to be rolled over. Well, I'll get it for him. The point is, Mr. Speaker, that it is true that before he joined the dark side, he used to criticize it. That is true. But he stopped criticizing it and started doing it when he joined them. Because it didn't end with the hospital. It carried on in other areas. And what I remember on one particular occasion, for example, when I noticed from the opposite benches a figure of 20 million pounds, which didn't seem to add up with the figures that had been provided to me in a big list of numbers. I have the advantage that I can home in to numbers, which many other people don't. And when I asked, what's this? The Honourable Chief Minister said he couldn't remember. And I found that odd. I mean, 20 million pounds is not pocket money. In fact, that's what I say about Istanbul loan. Of course, I know you do that. But the 20 million pounds was money that he had borrowed, but had forgot to tell us anything about, and he was going to do it to buy shares in a private company run by Mr. Pardo to do the central thing. Well, Midtown. I mean, and that was something that he didn't object to. Now, I didn't object to it either. I just asked, what's it for? And they couldn't remember. And it took more houses and more questions before the memory all came back and the amnesia disappeared. Well, look, if the honourable member wants to criticize the principle of the thing, he cannot criticize the principle of the thing because something is happening now with 100 million, which before happened with 10 million, because of course every year you will find that the volume of money gets bigger simply because everything that we're doing in a growing economy is related to a growing economy. I mean, the honourable member has never yet, since he started speaking on the level of debt, never yet talked about debt except in absolute terms. Talking about debt in absolute terms, if he cares to speak to his learned backbencher, is being an economic illiterate. We were constantly told you're an economic illiterate because you say the debt is 100. You mustn't say it's 100. You must say it's 10% of GDP or 5% of GDP. And that's the only measure that counts. I don't mind him using figures, but he belongs to a party that considers that to be evidence of illiteracy. Unless, of course, now that he's leading it, the doctrine has changed. But in other areas, it doesn't seem to have changed. Look, I must say I tended to agree with him that when the article that he or the questions that he answered in this article was printed and I read it. Don't read very much these days, but they sent it and I saw his picture on the front. So I thought, well, maybe I can find out what he's up to. And what do I find? What measures does the GSD have in mind to help the benefit of the small business community? This is one of the areas, like so many areas, that we are taking soundings and consulting business as to what their concerns and requirements are. Ergo, to use a new jargon that I've just heard from him and his predecessor, ergo, I haven't got a clue. I mean, my Latin is a bit rusty since I stopped using it in church and they went into English. We have taken a view that as a responsible opposition, we have an obligation to spell out our policies and ideas in any given areas. For this reason, we have already announced many months that our policy ideas on important matter. Well, look, all the policy ideas that he started spelling is that he's going to go around asking people what they want. And I was impressed last time, and I responded to him when he said, you know, that it's not in Gibraltar's interest that the political debate should be about an auction for votes by saying who promises to do more. I agree entirely with him on that, and therefore I was a bit disappointed because he seemed to be heading in that direction, and I believe that he was right in what he said the last time, and it's a philosophy that I agree with. I think we have to commit ourselves to doing the things that we think are needed and we believe we can afford to deliver. And we may have different priorities. That is to say, one party may attach more importance to one thing and another party to another, and then the choice for the people is whether they want a particular direction or another direction. But if we all promise everything to everyone and then it's just a question of how much more we can do, the answer is, in the long run, we will all live to regret it. And therefore, I have to tell him that although I will not be correcting his figures on this occasion, I'm afraid they're not right.
Does any other honourable member wish to speak on the motion? Call upon the mover to reply.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for now having accepted that this is an important motion that I bring. Because a few minutes earlier, or at least 2 hours, 3 hours earlier, he said that the motions I brought were just a waste of time designed to filibuster. So the duality, Mr. Speaker, returns. 1 minute we're told one thing, the next we're told something else. But something quite dramatically different. One moment we're told something is worthless, and the next moment we're told something is of huge value. So one moment it's black, one moment it's white. You wouldn't really expect that other than from somebody who one moment was GSLP and the next moment is GSD. I've reminded him, I think, Mr. Speaker, in my first budget reply, that he really does remind me of a soldier sometimes. Left, right. We just don't know which side he may be on a particular day. But, Mr. Speaker, he says that this is the first time in the history of this Parliament that somebody has brought a motion about something in a magazine, as if to say, about something outside of this House. Well, I mean, Mr. Speaker, he must really have a short memory, because in September 2011, the Honourable, the now backbencher as Chief Minister at the time, as the leader of the House, brought a motion not about a magazine, but about my Facebook page, Mr. Speaker, and something that I had said there. He called it, Mr. Speaker, he called that magnificent exposition of the financial situation in which Gibraltar found itself at the time, a grubby podcast, Mr. Speaker. A grubby podcast. Mr. Speaker, I must be a bit behind, Mr. Speaker. I must be a bit behind, because I always consider myself to be avant-garde in terms of technology, and I haven't brought a motion about something happening on Tumblr. I've brought it about something happening in the old paper form of magazine. Perhaps I should have gone for the issue version of the magazine online and quoted that in the motion. And the Honourable Member might not then have drawn this distinction. Because this is not the first motion that is brought about something that has happened outside of this House, or said by a member of this House outside of this House. And he was here, Mr. Speaker. I forget where he used to sit, Mr. Speaker, to be told to be quiet when the Honourable, the Leader of the Opposition, wanted him to. I think it was in that region. But he must have been asleep at the time, Mr. Speaker. Because this is clearly not the first time that such a thing happens. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, he's wrong about that as well. But he accuses me, Mr. Speaker, perhaps in an accusation as erroneous as all the others. And I note that he seems to be sleepy, but we are expecting him to speak on the next motion, Mr. Speaker. That I engage mouth before brain. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll let others be the judge of that, because I clearly cannot accept it. I wouldn't do it if I accepted it. I wouldn't do it if I knew I was doing it. But let's let others be the judge of one and not try and be judges of ourselves, for reasons that I'll come along to in a moment in relation to certain of the other accusations that the Honourable Gentleman makes. But he says is that I engage mouth before brain. Isn't that was exactly what he was doing when 180 minutes ago he described the motions I bring as a waste of time, only to now describe one of them as actually a very important motion? Or is that what was happening when he was sitting here as a member of the government, when a motion was brought about something happening in Facebook and he now says that this has never happened before? Mr. Speaker, The honourable member says things which are demonstrably untrue, as I have now seen he accepts about some of the things he said in Touch, to such an extent that he gives credence to Bernard Shaw's statement, Mr. Speaker, that politics is sometimes the paradise of charlatans, Mr. Speaker. He says that people hold their breath when I'm about to speak on the subject of Spain. That people hold their collective breath when I'm about to speak on the subject of Spain, because actually things are better handled calmly, etc., as no doubt he would wish people to impute. He suggests he would handle matters if he were ever in a position of authority to do so, well, Mr. Speaker. I know when people held their breaths that summer. People held their breaths that summer, Mr. Speaker, when once again, like the erstwhile Ken Boone of the television series of the same name, he got on his white charger. I think he might have been in France on holiday that September or August, Mr. Speaker, to come back to Gibraltar to help the government in dealing with the aggression from the Spanish state. And he went on television, Mr. Speaker, or radio, and was reported in the Gibraltar Chronicle as saying, of course I would be prepared to remove the concrete blocks. And Gibraltar collectively took a deep breath and thought, what sort of political animal is this, the like of which we have not seen before, that is prepared to bend his arm or allow his arm to be bent with the pressure that is being put to bear on our community, today on this subject, tomorrow on another, and on the third on the issue of sovereignty. He tuts, Mr. Speaker, but the headline in the Chronicle was very clear, and his words were not capable of another interpretation, to such an extent that you spend most of the next month trying to say that he meant something different. So, if I have heard the sharp collective intake of breath once in this community, it was then. It was then, Mr. Speaker. A sharp collective intake of breath demonstrating the concern that the man who the party in opposition were putting up to be chief minister might be of the ilk that one day he might have a position of responsibility and his arm may be as twistable as he demonstrated on that day it is, on a subject as important as our defense of British Gibraltar territorial waters. Not quite, Mr. Speaker, the negotiator that people will want to put in the chair, and I have the privilege and honor of incumbing at the will of the people of Gibraltar. And Mr. Speaker, he says that he accepts, and I commend him for it, that I did not say, as he said to the magazine, that I had compared North Korea to Spain at the United Nations. He says it's worse, Mr. Speaker. I was wrong in the magazine, but it is worse. You did it on Sky News on the BBC, and I say to him also on Channel 4. Worse because it went around the world. Not worse, Mr. Speaker. Well thought out, calmly delivered, designed to go around the world, and in that way, what had always been a little local difficulty for the world that Spain could get away with, bullying us, setting up the queues. And when I say Spain, Mr. Speaker, of course I don't mean my cousins in Los Barrios or La Linea, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what we managed was that by artfully ensuring that we captured the imagination of the world's media, Spain, its Partido Popular government, and of course Mr. Margallo, were exposed to the scrutiny of the world's press that then saw what was happening here, and we soon were able to use that as leverage. Are relations as they should be? No. Have we been able to cure the ill with which Mr. Margallo was obviously elected? No, Mr. Speaker, but I challenge him to say that he would be enjoying a cozy relationship with Mr. Margallo, because there's only one way that he might be enjoying that cozy relationship. But by comparing Spain to North Korea, Mr. Speaker, at that moment, what we did was manage to get the world's attention. Because the world's attention was not on us, when we had queues of 3 and 4 hours, because that was just a little local difficulty in Gibraltar. And the Honourable, the Father of the House, was ahead of him in reprimanding me for that, Mr. Speaker, for that comparison, for that odious comparison, as the Father of the House saw it, because given his socialist credentials, he doesn't see that there is necessarily anything wrong with North Korea, and I shouldn't have been comparing the behavior of Senor Margallo with them. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman has been left with having to say, but because you didn't say the government of Spain, or Mr. Margallo, or the Partido Popular, you tarnished the whole of Spain with that brush. You therefore annoyed everyone in Spain, even those who might be our erstwhile friends. Well, Mr. Speaker, he's got it completely wrong. And the proof that he has got it completely wrong is that in international politics, in international diplomacy even, and politics and diplomacy are two different things, and politicians are not diplomats. Officials are diplomats. Politicians are politicians. One often might refer to a nation when representing the actions of its government. Spain does it of us, we do it of Spain, Spain does it of the United Kingdom does it of Spain. The Honourable, the backbencher, when he was addressing the United Nations on a number of occasions when I was proudly there with the Father of the House, would often say, what Spain cannot do, what Spain cannot sustain. He wasn't required to say what the government of the United Kingdom of Spain, what the political party that is today in government in the Kingdom of Spain. Speaker of the United Nations used to give a speech quickly, in 8 minutes sometimes. It's not fair that we should only have 8 minutes, but that's sometimes what we have. And we cannot say the government of the Kingdom of Spain every time that we have to say it. And neither do diplomats or politicians, and everybody knows what is meant by it. But perhaps he is the only one who doesn't know. Perhaps he's the only one who thinks that I was comparing the government of Spain that did the trilateral agreement, which we support, and the Cordova agreements, parts of which we support, with the government that was setting up the 7-hour queues. Everybody else knew that that is what we meant. And in fact, the Honourable Gentleman, in throwing my words back at me, has made the point more eloquently, inadvertently, of course. Because I said, the face of Spain that we see today is no different to that to which we saw in the 50s and 60s. It is reminiscent of North Korea. The face of Spain is not my cousin in Los Barrios, is not the magnificent Gema Araujo in La Línea of the Socialist Party, is not Señor Moratinos, because they were not the face of Spain in August 2013. Unfortunately, we might all think, although who the Spanish people choose as their government is a matter entirely for them. The face of Spain is its government, the Partido Popular government. And Mr. Speaker, am I the only one who thinks that the comparison between Spain and North Korea was apposite? Well, Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Westminster Parliament, when they were analysing the matter of Gibraltar, and they actually came here and took my evidence at the Garrison Library, and they invited representations from third parties, although I note the Honourable Gentleman did not bother to even ask them for the opportunity to address them, produced a table in their excellent report. And the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Westminster Parliament often does ride in at just the right time to push the executive, the British government, in the right direction. The Honourable, the backbencher, had the benefit of that in 2002, 2003, and in the late 90s, Mr. Speaker, and I had the benefit, and Gibraltar had the benefit of it 2 years ago. The Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Speaker, included in their findings a table that set out the nations, the ambassadors of whom had most been called to the Foreign Office for a ticking off, i.e. a cup of tea, right? And in that table, the Foreign Affairs Committee thought it was appropriate to include North Korea, Mr. Speaker. Useful, Mr. Speaker, in particular for one reason. Because their ambassador being called in twice less often than the Spanish ambassador being called in over Gibraltar. Well, Speaker, moreover, this is not the only time that Spain has been compared to North Korea. A Spanish magistrate, his name is Elpidio José Silva, was recently being dealt with by the Spanish Supreme Court in Madrid, and he said that the standards being applied to him in justice were reminiscent of North Korea. So at least there's one Spaniard that agrees with me, Mr. Speaker. I follow the Spanish news, and this was the lead on the Televisión Española news on one particular occasion. It's clear the honourable gentleman doesn't. But what annoyed Spanish public opinion about something I said at the United Nations was not the comparison with North Korea. And it is true. I said something at the United Nations, not that, because I didn't say it at the United Nations, that led to my statements being deprecated, not just by Partido Popular politicians, but also by Socialist Party politicians. And the honourable gentleman should know what it is. I rely on him to know what it is, because he's the leader of the opposition, and he could be in government. That's what politics and democracy is about. But he needs to know these things. He needs to pay more attention to that than to some of the things that he's obviously paying attention to. I was deprecated by politicians in Spain on both sides of the Partido Popular and Socialist Party divide for having told the fourth committee, I believe, not the Committee of 24, I believe the fourth committee, that a Spanish Guardia Civil vessel had shot at a Gibraltarian jet skier a rubber bullet in British Gibraltar territorial waters. I stand by what I said. I have seen the video evidence. A complaint was made to the Royal Gibraltar Police. The Royal Gibraltar Police elevated that complaint to both the government of Gibraltar and the convent. The convent and the government of Gibraltar elevated that complaint to the Foreign Office, and the Minister for Europe sought explanations in writing from his counterparts in Madrid. The explanation, of course, was eventually it didn't happen, despite the video evidence. That led to my being condemned by Partido Popular politicians and Socialist Party politicians and by the union that represents the Guardia Civil. If what the honourable gentleman is telling the public in Gibraltar is that if a Gibraltarian is shot at in British Gibraltar territorial waters, there is video evidence of that. The complaint is elevated by the Royal Gibraltar Police to the government of Gibraltar and the convent. The convent and the government of Gibraltar elevate that complaint to the Foreign Office and the Minister for Europe. And the Minister for Europe puts that complaint in writing, therefore also believing in it, because we've all seen the video evidence, that the Chief Minister of Gibraltar should not reflect that at the United Nations when he goes to report to the Fourth Committee, which is looking at the Article 173 report made under the Charter, which the colonizing or administering power is making to the Fourth Committee, should not report that because it might annoy Spanish political representatives, in fact, all of whom might be trying to curry favor with the union of the Guardia Civil, despite it being clear that it happened. Then, Mr. Speaker, that is another piece of crucial evidence of what the honourable gentleman might be like as a Chief Minister. So, Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to say that you don't poke your finger in people's eyes just to annoy them. But it's quite another to say, when the heat of international public opinion is focused on Gibraltar, I might remove the blocks. Sharp intake of breath from the community. It's quite another, Mr. Speaker, to say, I don't want to see Spanish politicians annoyed with us, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would not say at the United Nations things that might annoy them. whether the Socialist Party is annoyed or the Partido Popular is annoyed. We have lots of friends in the Socialist Party, very few, but some friends in the Partido Popular, Mr. Speaker. But when things happen, they must be elevated to the right level. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, in the time that they were in office and in the time that we were in office, when the Honourable the Father of the House returned to the United Nations, there have been occasions when we have had to say such things. The Honourable the backbencher has on occasion referred to frontier queues in the time before the 2003 election of the Socialist Party in Madrid, when he had to deal with Señor Matutes, and after that with Señor Piqué, when he was reporting the conniving attempt by the then British government and the Spanish government to deal with the joint sovereignty issues. We annoyed everybody, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I dare say that I have not yet managed to annoy the British government and the Spanish government, and even the Spanish opposition probably at the time, as much as the Honourable the backbencher managed to do in 2002-2003 with the full support of everybody in this House and in the rest of Gibraltar, when he was defeating, with the support of all of us, the joint sovereignty attempts by the United Kingdom government. But to have a leader of the opposition who is seriously saying, you've got to mind your P's and Q's at the United Nations, whatever it is that you may be reporting, is absolutely wrong. And in his mind, my comparison of North Korea and Spain, and the report of what happened on that water, on that day, risking the life of that Gibraltarian when he was shot at with a rubber bullet by the Guardia Civil, are all one. And he's absolutely wrong to rule out the fact that you sometimes have to put yourself in political harm's way because your job is to defend Gibraltar and the Gibraltarians and to tell the UN what is happening, how it's happening, and when it's happening. But, Mr. Speaker, that tangentially led him to say that he was going to comment about the fishing agreement, and he said, now there is no rule of law in Gibraltar because of the way that the Honourable Gentleman has dealt with the fishing agreement. Previously there was, now there isn't. For all my talk of the rule of law, he said, Mr. Speaker, of me, the rule of law is now something which is no longer respected since I took over. Mr. Speaker, we've had this debate on a number of occasions. To respect the rule of law, one has to say the law should be applied fairly and equally to all, without discrimination or distinction. We make laws in this Parliament. We do not enforce laws. The Honourable Gentleman seems to think that if he is in government, he is responsible for the enforcement of laws. And he has already on a number of occasions suggested that what he might do in that respect. Well, Mr. Speaker, another third piece of evidence of why people might want to think twice before ever giving him the responsibility of being Chief Minister. But, Mr. Speaker, what does drive a coach and horses through the rule of law is to have an agreement between the government, in particular a government which involves him, because he was a member of it for 4 years, that allows third parties, namely people from outside Gibraltar, to offend against a particular act of this Parliament and allow that to happen by agreement. That's a real driving of a coach and horses through the rule of law. And that, Mr. Speaker, as I've often told the House, is what we interpret the 1999 agreement to be, since the days that Joshua Gabay, more eloquently than I ever will be able to, put the argument in 1999 to the Honourable then Leader of the House. But let us have an objective assessment of the subject, Mr. Speaker, of whether the rule of law is respected in Gibraltar since I took over or not, without regard to what was happening before. Let's just deal with his allegation that under me the rule of law is to be considered not being observed. Well, Mr. Speaker, as the House knows, and I was very humbled and privileged to accept, a citation came from London, from the Minister for Europe to His Excellency the Governor, proposing that I should be appointed Queen's Counsel on the basis, and this is their citation, not mine, of my commitment to the observance of the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, the proposal of the Minister for Europe was accepted by His Excellency the Governor on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen, given that that is his role and representation in Gibraltar, and by the Supreme Court of Gibraltar. If I had to choose who to be judged by, Mr. Speaker, objectively, fairly, and without any reason politically for wanting to propose the opposite, I would rather be judged by the Chief Justice in the Supreme Court, the Governor and the Minister for Europe, than by him. And, Mr. Speaker, I now am very proud indeed that the grandchild of the Attorney General's maid is now a Queen's Counsel on the basis of that particular citation. Mr. Speaker, but perhaps there is another opportunity. That is a reference, Mr. Speaker, to the fact that my grandmother used to be a maid for the Attorney General in the 1930s. Mr. Speaker, and she's from Los Barrios, which is where my cousins, who were not so annoyed at my remarks of the United Nations, come from. Just to explain it to him, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but to say that the whole community has seen that the undoing of the fishing agreement without a replacement is something which enjoys universal condemnation and exposed me to criticism. Well, Mr. Speaker, it exposed me to criticism from him. Constantly. Because he's got very few arguments and he makes them all the time, and though none of them are valid. But for example, it didn't expose me to criticism from Louis Wink. Because when I met Louis Wink, who was then Commissioner of Police, the week after we were elected, not 3 months later, when the Honourable Mr. Cortés confirmed on Facebook what I had done on behalf of the government and in implementation of our manifesto commitment, Mr. Speaker, when I told Louis Wink that the government did not consider that he should be bound by the 1999 fishing agreement, Louis said to me in that usual earthy tone for which he is famous, Mr. Pigaldo, Chief Minister, thank goodness, I feel liberated at last. That agreement was untenable. It stopped us from doing what we had to do. Now we are free to act in the way that we consider is appropriate. It should never have been done. So, regardless of what his recollection might be, at least I have the comfort of knowing, Mr. Speaker, that one of his executive members agreed with me at the time. And, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member then went on to talk about public debt and lack of transparency and said it's all my fault. I didn't know whether to be heartened or concerned, Mr. Speaker, because in speaking to the other motion, again the duality came in, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the other motion, he said that it was the Honourable, the Father of the House, who was running public finances and the economy and all the rest of it. And therefore, he was very happy with it. In fact, it was all in his hands, rather his hands than mine and all the rest of it. In this motion, he wanted to say the opposite. So the fact that he'd said one thing and was now going to say the other was, of course, of absolutely no concern whatsoever. He said, it's all your fault, Chief Minister. You're the one who is creating all this lack of transparency or this failure to answer questions. Having also said that it's now the Father of the House who answers those questions because I've given him a specific ministerial responsibility for the savings bank, which is where the money from credit finance flows. And then, Mr. Speaker, he did one of his, to do a loose translation of a Spanish phrase. Hizo una de la suya. He said, Mr. Speaker, as I demonstrated in the earlier motion, my recollection is that he lost the vote on the other motion, that actually the Father of the House got up and demonstrated that everything he'd said in relation to public finances and the economy was wrong, and the demonstration was of not knowing what he was talking about and not that what he was talking about was correct. So, how could it get worse, Mr. Speaker? How could it all get worse? Well, it could get worse in one particular way. He didn't just admit that what he'd said in the context of the magazine he admitted was incorrect, for which I commend him. He then went on to say that, in fact, everything that is going to be said in the estimates book soon to be published is going to be a false picture, tarnishing not just me and the Father of the House, both of us, or one of us, or each of us, I don't know in what particular mood he may be at the moment, but every civil servant in the Treasury who is involved, and the Financial Secretary, who, as we all know, is not a civil servant at the moment. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is really quite extraordinary. It is quite extraordinary that he has given notice, Mr. Speaker, in effect, that he will not believe what he reads in the estimates book. Mr. Speaker, even if he were not to believe it, he's got the estimates book, he's got the balance sheet of credit finance, he's got where the investments of the savings bank is. Mr. Speaker, he's got more information than we ever had. He's probably got more information than most people have. But he has put us on notice that he does not believe the estimates. Well, Mr. Speaker, last year they were saved by the bell because the backbencher came in just in time as they were considering either abstaining or not voting in favor of the budget. But in the time that has passed since that debate, and will pass before the next debate, you never know, there might even be an election between now and then, I challenge him, given that he disagrees with how the money is going to be spent, given that he now says he won't believe the estimates book, to vote against the budget, to have the courage of his convictions, which he says he has, and when we debate the appropriation bill, to vote against the appropriation bill. But I know he won't do that, because the duality will kick in, and having the courage of your convictions will mean getting up, saying one thing, and voting quite the other way. And if it were anybody else, it would surprise me, but it's him. And Mr. Speaker, then he said that I'd gone around Gibraltar telling people that Gibraltar was bankrupt. Well, although he was here for the 2011-2012 budget debate on the appropriation bill for that year, he obviously didn't hear what I had to say. The Honourable the backbencher did, and brought a self-serving and aggressive motion to try and deal with the important point I was making, to try and obfuscate it a little bit in terms much more aggressive, much more aggressive than I am bringing motions. Because it was a motion that said not just what the facts of the motion said, but it reached a conclusion that said that I was therefore unfit to govern. And I said, this is a kangaroo court. I am being tried by a majority that is going to follow, because in those days, of course, this lot were whipped, and they all had to vote with the head honcho. In this instance, they will all vote their consciences, right? Right? And that I was unfit to govern. Unfit to govern. And I said, the people of Gibraltar will decide who is fit to govern. And Mr. Speaker, they were the judges of whether I was fit to govern or not, and they returned a verdict that I was. And I don't appreciate that they appear to be too angry with the work that I'm doing, but they will have their opportunity to return a new verdict very shortly. You never know, perhaps even before the budget. And therefore, if I stand here in future, it is only because motions brought by the honourable members last time, with the vitriol and what the honourable gentleman commended to the Hon. Charles Blusson as the essential element of politics, namely mala leche, and not the way we do things, because actually they really are not as relevant as the honourable members obviously thought. But what I said during the course of that budget debate was, by the measure applied in 1996 or 1995, which was the last budget debate, by you, then Chief Minister, let us look at what the debt per capita is today and how it's grown. And if it's grown so much, and you were so concerned in 1995, shouldn't we, by applying that measure, be equally concerned? In the same way as in my budget speeches, some of which I would commend to the honourable gentleman, in particular those I gave when I was in opposition and had more time to be inspired and to search through for some excellent comparisons, with social insurance. Because I used to say to the honourable gentleman, the GSLP raised social insurance when it was in government. And we don't resile from the fact that that was appropriate at the time. You at the time criticised the increases in social insurance, and I hesitate to say you. I'm using that as shorthand. I believe it might have been Mr. Vasquez, who was on his front bench in opposition before then. And you, the GSD in opposition, used to call social insurance increases as taxation by the back door. No. Taxation by the back door, or some similar description, which was not a tax on jobs, right? Hidden taxation, I think. Hidden taxation was the phrase. And I used to say to him, the GSLP used to put up social insurance. There's nothing wrong in doing so. But by your standards, you are putting up this hidden taxation by X amount, sometimes more than inflation, etc., etc. The trick always was, I just let the honourable gentleman into it, the trick always was, you put it up the year after the election and 2 years before. You don't put it up the year of the election, and the year after the election you put it up by more than you should have put it up for the year 2 years before. Something we have demonstrated we have not done. But Mr. Speaker, putting up social insurance contributions is something that sometimes has to happen. But what I was doing in taking the argument to the honourable gentleman, as I was doing on debt, was saying, by the measure you established. So if he wants to come back at me and say, but you said about debt, and now you are doing, he needs to look at what I actually said about debt, and what I said they would do, because another thing I said they would do, was that if they were elected, they would increase the debt quite considerably. Of course, it caught us all by surprise that the debt had been increased very, very considerably, and we only found out, having had the estimates book in April, estimating that debt would be 480 million, I believe. We only found out, and I say we, because I mean Mr. Sopaldi, who was the leader of the PDP, myself and the rest of the community, on the night of the leaders' debate, when we were finally told by the honourable gentleman, it had gone up to 520 million. And that's why I used to say, how are they going to fund their manifesto DEBT debt? But of course, the other argument available, Mr. Speaker, is that one of the things the honourable gentleman constantly says is that we are receiving a lot of money in the context of tobacco sales, and that our revenue is up. And Mr. Speaker, either we're taking more debt or our revenue is up. Mr. Speaker, he's got to try and be consistent in some way in the way that he deals with these things. But he's got to look at what I said before the election. And he says he criticized the PFI when he was the leader of the now defunct Labour Party, the one that merged with the GSD but accepted the name of the GSD, and that only one, two of its members should be in the executive. And he said, I don't like debt which is off balance sheet. And nobody has dealt with that better than I saw the father of the house deal with it a moment ago. Because, of course, it wasn't just the PFI deal that related to the hospital that honourable members did of balance sheet. There was a lot more done of balance sheet. Or does he forget the £100 million hole that we found in companies when we were elected? That is in addition to the 520 million of debt that there was. Or does he forget, Mr. Speaker, or is it, Mr. Speaker, that he was, to take his phraseology, blissfully unaware of the deals being done by the government of which he was a member, i.e. between 2007 and 2011, on the Midtown and on the car parks? Mr. Speaker, does he not know those things? Was he really a member of the government, or was he, perhaps like the others who accompanied the now backbencher in his journey through government, really no more than a decorative wallflower? Mr. Speaker, I have pursued the facts. I have reflected that this motion does not call for people to judge or the honourable member to be fit or unfit for any purpose. That is a matter for the general public. But simply that the House should reflect and condemn the fact that the public are being misled, and I will commend him for the fact that indeed he has accepted that some of the things that he said in this magazine were wrong, although he has then tried to create one of those smokescreens which he is so adept at producing but so unable to maintain in trying to avoid the inevitable conclusion that the motion is correct, it should be supported. And Mr. Speaker, I therefore commend the motion to the House, seek its support, and as the Honourable the backbencher did earlier, seek that each member be polled individually in respect of the vote.
I now
Speaker,
put the question in the
before
terms
you do,
of the motion
the
proposed.
the word prevent should be pervert in the motion. I think that's
There is a typographical error in the motion. Instead of prevent, in the last paragraph, it should be pervert. I now put the Question in terms of the motion proposed by the Chief Minister. Division is required.
Balban. J.J. Vosano. D.J. Vocino. P.R. Caruana. P.R. Caruana. J. Cortez. N.F. Costa. D.A. Feetham.
No.
S.M. Figueras.
No.
A.J. Isola.
Aye.
G.H. Likudi.
Yes.
S.E. Linares.
Yes.
J.J. Neto.
No.
F.R. Picardo.
Yes.
E.J. Reyes.
No.
S.J. Sacramento.
There are 2 honourable members who are absent, 9 in favour, 6 against. The motion is carried. We will now have a recess of 20 minutes.